Usually when you read like the prevailing literature on business communication, there's this underlying assumption that corporate meetings operate on this very straightforward, rational logic.
Right, yeah, like everyone's just a robot.
Exactly.
Mhm.
You picture a spreadsheet, right? You present the numbers, the profit is over here, the loss is over there, and the leader simply points at a cell and says, do this.
Yeah.
You just assume it's entirely binary.
It's a really comforting illusion. I mean, we desperately want corporate mechanics to be visible, to be strictly categorized, and above all, to be easily digestible without any emotional or psychological friction.
Oh, absolutely. But then you step into the actual unforgiving world of a high-stakes boardroom. I mean, picture it for a second. You are an entrepreneur. Your startup is scaling at an aggressive, almost, terrifying pace.
Yeah, which means there are operational fires burning in literally every single department.
Right. You walk into that room, and suddenly that clean spreadsheet mentality, it's completely shattered. You are swimming in these linguistic muddy waters. And if you don't know the difference between, say, bringing up an issue and taking it up, well, that room is going to swallow you whole.
It is the absolute definition of a battlefield of nuance. I mean, how you navigate the subtle mechanics of your vocabulary in those specific high-tension moments that determines whether you command the room or just, become a victim of its momentum.
And that is exactly what we are analyzing today in this deep dive. We're pulling apart a specialized transcript from a guide called Mastering the Art of Business Meeting Discourse. And our mission here is to extract the absolute highest level language used in a real-world high-stakes entrepreneurial meeting scenario. Because, the secret to projecting total unshakable competence in the C-suite, it isn't thrown around massive multisyllabic textbook vocabulary words.
It almost never is. There's this really common trap among emerging leaders where they think they need to sound like a walking thesaurus to command respect.
Oh, yeah, you see that all the time.
Right. But in practice, deploying overly academic vocabulary in a crisis, it just comes across as inauthentic, or worse, evasive. It sounds like you're hiding behind the dictionary.
Which is exactly why we're focusing exclusively on the subtle, highly strategic mechanics of C1 and C2 business phrasal verbs.
Yeah.
Those seemingly simple, like 2- or 3-word combinations that actually dictate the entire power dynamic of a room. We're going to equip you with the precise linguistic toolkit you need to open a meeting, challenge murky data, expose operational bottlenecks, and engineer solutions, all without ever sounding like you're trying too hard.
And just to set the parameters for how we're going to dissect this is not going to be a dry linguistic seminar.
Thank goodness.
Right. We aren't going to talk about whether a verb has Germanic roots or how it evolved in the 16th century. No one cares in a boardroom. We are strictly analyzing these phrases as instruments of power and control.
Just purely practical application.
Exactly. We're going to act as a fly on the wall during a critical scale-up meeting featuring 3 key figures from our source material.
Yeah, so to give you the context of the room we're walking into, it's a story you will instantly recognize if you've spent any time in the startup ecosystem. Sitting at the head of the table is the chair, so the founder, the ultimate decision maker.
Right.
To their right is Mark, who handles data, supply chain, and operational metrics. He's the numbers guy. And to their left is Sarah, who oversees support, team dynamics, and the whole human element of the operation.
And the stakes they're dealing with, it's a classic scaling paradox. Sales are up, the market momentum is undeniably there, but behind the scenes, delivery issues and severe staffing shortages are creating these fault lines that threaten to tear the entire operation apart.
It's the classic growing pains. So let's look at how this meeting actually begins. Because every successful meeting has to execute a definitive pivot. You have to aggressively transition the room from the casual pre-meeting chatter, the weekend recaps, the coffee talk, into focused, ruthless execution.
Yeah, you have to flip the switch.
Exactly. We start by looking at how the chair takes absolute control of the room and sets a rigorous agenda. The chair opens by saying, I think we can get started. We have quite a bit to go over today, so let's get down to business.
Let's get down to business. I mean, it's a phrase we hear so often that our brains almost filter it out as white noise.
Yeah, it's a total cliche, right?
It feels like one, sure. But if we analyze the psychological weight of that specific construction, it's incredibly potent. It acts as a definitive audio cue, a psychological boundary line drawn right in the sand.
Which completely changes the ownership of the time in the room.
Yeah.
I mean, before you say that phrase, the time belongs to the individual sitting at the table.
Right.
The second that phrase drops, the time belongs entirely to the company.
Precisely. And notice the directional nature of the phrasing, too. Getting down implies a physical descent, right? A grounding of the room's energy.
Oh, I see what you mean.
You're leaving the airy, abstract realm of small talk and bringing the collective focus down to the solid, tangible, heavy reality of the work. It literally forces a physical shift in the posture of the people in the room. People stop leaning back and they lean forward over the table.
It's basically the corporate equivalent of a director calling action on a movie set.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Because before action, everyone's tweaking lights, they're sipping water, adjusting microphones. It's totally chaotic.
Right?
But the millisecond that word is spoken, the camera is rolling, the stakes are real, and every single person is locked in.
Yeah, exactly. The chair isn't just starting a clock, they're demanding a psychological shift. And the moment that shift happens, the chair immediately deploys this rapid-fire sequence of agenda-setting verbs.
Yeah, they say, first I'll run through the main points, and then we can take up each issue one by one, and then they outline the specific flow. Like, let's start with the sales figures. Then we'll move on to the delivery problems, look into the customer feedback, and finally work out what we want to do next.
The momentum in that single sentence is just staggering. Run through, take up, start with, move on to, work out. These are intensely kinetic verbs.
Very active.
Very. But the strategic brilliance here is how the chair contrasts two of those verbs right at the beginning to control the level of debate in the room. They say, I'll run through the main points and then we can take up each issue.
Break the strategy down there for us. Why differentiate the two?
Well, because running through something implies velocity. It is a high-level, surface-level listing of the territory. By explicitly stating, I will run through, the chair is implicitly signaling to Mark and Sarah, do not interrupt me during this phase.
So it's about control.
Exactly. You aren't stopping to debate the terrain, you are just establishing the map. It's a method of preempting interruptions. But then the chair pivots to take up. Taking up an issue assigns heavy cognitive weight to it. It implies lifting something heavy together and wrestling with it deeply.
Okay, wait, hold on. You're losing me a bit here with the nuance.
Also,
Well, if I tell my team I want to bring up an issue, or if I say I want to take up an issue, they mean exactly the same thing in reality, don't they? I'm just pointing at a problem we need to talk about. It feels like you're splitting hairs.
it might sound like splitting hairs, yeah. But in the context of boardroom power dynamics, the distinction is literally the difference between being a passive participant and an active leader.
Really? Just from bring versus take.
Yes. Think about it. Bringing up an issue is merely the act of placing the item on the table for everyone to look at. It's just an introduction. You can bring up a problem and walk away.
Okay, yeah.
But taking up an issue means you are actively assuming responsibility for dissecting it and resolving it. When you take up a cause, you are committing to the labor it requires.
Okay, I see the distinction now. So bringing it up is merely pointing at the fire in the corner of the room.
Yeah.
Taking it up is actually grabbing the fire extinguisher and dealing with it.
Exactly. And this dynamic plays out beautifully in the source material right after the chair sets the agenda. Sarah, who represents the human element, realizes her biggest crisis isn't on the docket, so she interjects.
Right.
She says, could we also bring up the staffing issue? We've been running short of people in the support team.
She is strategically placing a new, heavy object on the table that wasn't there a second ago. She is bringing it up.
Yes, she is forcing the issue into the collective field of vision. And the chair's response is just a masterclass in executive communication.
Because they don't panic.
Right. The chair doesn't panic, doesn't shut her down, but also doesn't let her derail the momentum. The chair says, absolutely, we'll fit that in after the delivery discussion.
Fit that in. That is such a brilliant way to handle an interruption.
It really is, because it accomplishes two completely contradictory things at the exact same time. First, it acknowledges that the meeting operates on a very tight, inflexible, predefined schedule. That's the fit part. It treats the agenda like a tightly packed suitcase or, a Tetris game.
Right.
But simultaneously, by agreeing to fit that in, the chair completely validates Sarah's concern. It's a calculated inclusion rather than a blunt dismissal.
Which keeps Sarah engaged rather than making her feel totally alienated. I mean, if the chair had just said, we don't have time to talk about that, Sarah shuts down for the rest of the meeting.
Exactly. You lose her entirely.
So what happens to a leadership team if a CEO or a chair fails to use these active directional verbs? Like, what if they don't explicitly say, we are going to move on to this, or we need to work out that?
The meeting inevitably devolves into a swamp. Yeah. Without verbs that imply forward, structural motion, basic human nature just takes over. People tend to sit around and admire the problem. They complain, they vent, they point fingers, but they never progress toward action. These specific phrasal verbs move on to, take up, work out. They are the actual engine that drives the psychology of the room forward. They force progression.
You either steer the ship or the current takes you.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the next phase of this meeting. Because once that agenda is locked in and the room is focused, a highly functional team doesn't just immediately start brainstorming. They have to look backwards before they can look forwards.
Right, you need that continuity.
Yeah, they have to verify that the things they talked about last week actually happened. Which brings us to the accountability check. We transition to the phase of the meeting where Mark, our data and ops guy, has to answer for a previous supply chain failure.
The transition the chair uses here is seamless but very firm. They say, before we move on, let's go over what we agreed on last time.
Go over. It's a very physical action, isn't it? Like taking a flashlight and sweeping the beam across the floor of the past to make sure absolutely nothing was left behind in the dark.
That's a great way to picture it. And the specific task Mark was given in the previous meeting is laid out clearly. The chair says, Mark, you are going to follow up with the supplier and find out why the shipment was late.
Let's unpack the accountability loop in that sentence. Follow up with and find out.
I want to focus intensely on those two verbs because they are the absolute cornerstone of middle management accountability. Follow up with implies the persistence required to chase down an external party. But you cannot just pair it with a passive outcome.
What do you mean?
Well, you can't just tell your boss, I followed up. The chair immediately pairs it with find out. Find out is an aggressively active verb. It demands a concrete result. It implies that the truth was hidden or obscured or actively withheld, and Mark had to do the investigative labor to uncover it.
So it eliminates the excuse of, well, I sent them an email, but they didn't reply. That might be following up, but it definitely isn't finding out.
Precisely. It closes the loophole of passive activity. So the chair probes further. They ask, and did we hear back from them? And Mark replies, yes. They got back to us on Friday. The delay was caused by a shortage of parts.
Okay, I have to jump in here because this drives me crazy. The chair explicitly asks, did we hear back? And Mark replies, they got back to us. Honestly, why does English need both of these phrases? They describe the exact same event. A message was sent and a message was received.
They describe the same event, sure, but from entirely different psychological and, frankly, legal perspectives.
Really? Legal?
Well, in a liability sense, yes. And in business, perspective is everything, especially when you are trying to establish a chain of custody for a failure. Let's break down the directionality here. When Mark says they got back to us, he makes the supplier the active agent of the sentence. The supplier generated the reply, the supplier initiated the contact, the supplier sent it over.
So the camera is pointed entirely at the supplier's actions.
Yes, but when the chair asks, did we hear back from them? The chair is centering Mark's reception of the information. The onus is placed entirely on Mark as the receiver.
Oh, I see.
Why is this critical? Because it dictates who dropped the ball if the communication breaks down. If Mark says, I never heard back from them, the linguistic implication is that Mark was actively listening, actively waiting by the phone, aggressively checking his inbox, and the total failure lies on the supplier's end.
Which completely shifts the liability in a corporate setting.
Exactly.
If I say they never got back to me, that's a bit passive.
Yeah.
It sounds like I threw a ball over a fence and just shrugged when it didn't come back. But if I say I never heard back, I'm establishing that my ear was to the ground the entire time. I was doing my job. They failed to do theirs.
Exactly right. It is a microscopic shift in phrasing, but it completely changes the implied professional responsibility. And the accountability check doesn't stop there. The chair pushes further, saying, and we agreed that you would look into alternative suppliers. Mark doesn't hesitate. He replies, I did. I've come up with 2 possible options.
Come up with, this is the moment Mark proves he belongs in the C-suite, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because he didn't just find 2 options on Google, he came up with them.
That is the crucial distinction. Look into is just the research phase. It means peering beneath the surface of a problem to observe the mechanics. Anybody can look into something and report back that it's broken.
Yeah, that's easy.
Right, but come up with implies active creative engineering. It shows that Mark didn't just diagnose the disease, he synthesized a cure from scratch. You pull a solution up from nothing. It denotes resourcefulness, which is the ultimate currency of a scaling startup.
Think about the massive implications of this for anyone listening who manages a remote team or, relies heavily on Asynchronous communication, Slack, Teams, email. When you aren't physically in the same room to see if someone is working, these specific verbs become the entire architecture of your trust, don't they?
They are the absolute lifeblood of asynchronous trust. If you manage a remote team and people don't follow up and external vendors don't get back to you, the business literally ceases to function.
It just stops.
Yeah. You have to rely on the vocabulary of accountability to know that the gears are still turning. You need to hire people who don't just look into problems, but who consistently come up with solutions before they even get on the Zoom call.
So Mark has successfully passed the accountability check. He did the investigative work. He brought solutions, which seamlessly moves the meeting into the next phase. Because the past is settled, but now Mark has to face the music of the present. We enter the reality check. Mark has to present the actual data of how the company's performing right now.
And this is where the spreadsheet mentality we talked about earlier completely falls apart, because in a high-growth startup, the numbers rarely tell a unified, cohesive story.
They usually tell a deeply conflicting story where you are experiencing like unprecedented growth and catastrophic failure at the exact same moment.
Yeah.
So Mark starts by delivering the good news. He says, let me run through the figures. Sales have gone up by 8%, while operating costs have gone down by 3%. The strongest growth has come from our online channel.
The verbs Mark uses here, gone up, gone down, come from. They're foundational, almost elementary English. But they are utilized because they are incredibly instantaneously visual.
It's physical motion mapping. You can literally see the line graph trending up and to the right in your mind's eye when you hear those phrases.
Yes, they bypass complex cognitive processing and paint an immediate picture. But then Mark has to deliver the poison pill. He shifts the tone and says, however, we're still falling behind in 2 regional markets.
Falling behind. I really want to linger on this phrase, because Mark could have easily said, we are missing our targets by 4% in 2 regions. That would be factually accurate. Why does the brain react so differently to falling behind than it does in missing a target?
Because missing a target is a static mathematical failure. It's a snapshot in time. A dart missed a dartboard. But falling behind triggers a deeply visceral neurological response tied to motion and survival. It paints a vivid picture of a foot race. The market is a pack of runners moving at a terrifying speed. Your competitors are pulling ahead, and your company is the runner whose lungs are burning, whose legs are heavy, watching the pack slowly disappear over the horizon.
Oh, wow. That is bleak.
It is. It implies a loss of relative momentum, which, to an entrepreneur, is infinitely more terrifying than a temporary dip in revenue.
Yeah. A static failure you can fix. A loss of momentum means the engine is dying, and the chair, feeling that existential threat, steps in immediately to stop the bleeding. The chair says, can you break that down for us? And Mark replies, sure. If you look at the figures by region, you'll see that the main shortfall is in the northern area.
Let's analyze the psychological intent behind the chair asking to break that down. In corporate reporting, aggregate data is the ultimate hiding place.
Right, because it averages everything out.
Exactly. If you just look at the top-line revenue, sales are up 8%. The company looks like a massive success. But aggregate data masks localized rot. To break something down means forcing the analyst to deconstruct the massive, safe aggregate numbers into granular, exposed, vulnerable, regional insights.
It's basically the analytical equivalent of a master chef tasting a complex, beautiful sauce that just tastes slightly wrong. The chef doesn't just throw the whole pot out and say, this is bad. They stand there and mentally deconstruct the flavor profile. They break it down on their palate to figure out exactly which single ingredient, maybe a quarter teaspoon of too much salt or a lack of acidity, is poisoning the entire batch. Mark is being forced to break down the aggregate victory to isolate the hidden disease.
That's a perfect way to look at it. And notice what happens linguistically when Mark isolates that disease. The phrasal verb falls short undergoes a metamorphosis. It transforms into a noun. Mark calls it a shortfall.
Why does corporate English do that so often?
Because it's a coping mechanism. Yeah, it happens constantly in high-level business discourse. You take a terrifying active verb falling short and you turn it into a static physical noun, a shortfall. Once it is a noun, it becomes an object on the table. And if it's an object, you can manage it, you can measure it, and you can eventually fix it.
It makes it less scary.
Exactly.
But Sarah, our VP of People and Ops, is listening to this, and she isn't satisfied with Mark's high-level regional explanation. Identifying where the problem is doesn't explain why it's happening. And this is where the tension in the room absolutely spikes. She interrupts the data review.
This is a great moment.
She said, "Sorry, could you go over that last point again? When you say we're falling behind, do you mean we're missing our sales targets?" Mark confirms, "Exactly." And then Sarah deploys an incredible potent phrase. She says, "Could you spell out what you think is causing the problem?"
And Mark, cornered by the precision of that question, admits the main issue seems to be delivery times. He points out the actual mechanical flaw.
Let's stop right here and dissect this, because this might be the most important psychological maneuver in the entire transcript. Sarah wants to know why the northern region is failing. If I'm in that meeting, my instinct is to just ask, "Mark, why are we missing the targets in the Noneth?" But Sarah doesn't do that. She says, "Could you spell out what you think is causing the problem?" What is the strategic advantage of deploying spell out in a high-tension confrontation?
The advantage is entirely about managing ego and defensive reflexes. Think about the intrinsic nature of the question, why?
Yeah, it's pretty blunt.
When you ask an executive, why are you failing? It almost always sounds accusatory. It triggers a defensive posture. The recipient feels like you are questioning their fundamental competence. But asking a colleague to spell out the problem is a polite, sophisticated C2 level maneuver that essentially says, "I need you to stop hiding behind vague corporate jargon."
It demands total transparency without sounding like an attack.
Precisely. Think about the literal act of spelling. If I ask you to spell a word, I am forcing you to break a complex sound down into every single individual isolated letter. A, B, C. You cannot blur the lines when you are spelling something out. There is nowhere to hide.
You are forcing Mark to remove the emotional padding from his explanation. It's brilliant because it completely de-escalates the interpersonal conflict while escalating the operational rigor. By asking him to spell out the causes, Sarah is attacking the mechanical process, not Mark's character. She isn't saying, "Mark, you are a failure." She is saying, "Mark, let's stand side by side and look closely at the granular components of this machine that isn't working."
And Mark recognizes the olive branch wrapped in a demand. He doesn't get defensive. He complies. He points out delivery times. Again, we see a highly visual spatial verb. He is taking his finger and placing it directly on the faulty gear inside the engine.
Which exposes a massive vulnerability in the company's operations. And Sarah, being an elite operator, recognizes that a vulnerability in one department is the perfect time to confess a vulnerability in her own. The hood of the car is already popped open. Mark is already bleeding on the table.
Right, it's the perfect opening.
So she initiates a massive pivot, bringing us to the next phase of the meeting, exposing the bottleneck.
She pivots with incredible grace. She says, "I'd like to bring up another issue. We've been having trouble keeping up with customer demand."
There's that phrase again, bring up. She is taking advantage of the open floor to place her own heavy, messy problem squarely in the center of the table. But the verb she uses to describe her crisis is deeply troubling. Keeping up with.
The phrase "keep up with" is the terrifying inverse of Mark's crisis. I want to connect this directly back to the phrase "fall behind" that Mark used earlier. We are back in that brutal foot race metaphor. But here is the catastrophic reality for this startup. They are fighting a war on two entirely different opposing fronts, and they are losing oxygen on both.
How so? Break that down for me.
Well, Mark's external sales team is falling behind the market competitors in the north, right?
Right.
While internally, Sarah's support team cannot keep up with the sheer volume of customers they already have.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. The pace of the market is exceeding their sales capacity, and simultaneously, the pace of the business is exceeding the operational capacity of the staff. It's a classic scaling nightmare.
You're running too slow and too fast at the exact same time.
Yep.
The chair hears this and asks for clarification. What seems to be the problem? Sarah lays it out bare. Our current team can't keep up with the number of incoming requests. And then Mark, surprisingly, jumps in to provide cross-departmental cover for her. He adds context, saying, "I'd also point out that we're spending too much time dealing with manual requests."
Notice Mark's use of dealing with. It carries immense semantic weight. You don't deal with a bonus check. You don't deal with a promotion. You deal with a persistent nuisance, a chronic pain, a severe point of friction.
Yeah, has a very negative connotation.
By calling it something they are dealing with, Mark is signaling to the chair that these manual requests aren't just work. They are toxic waste, slowing the entire machine down.
And the chair, who is listening to two distinct department heads align on a single internal crisis, validates the severity of the bottleneck instantly. The chair says, "That's something we'll need to sort out."
Sort out. If you want to project executive calm in the middle of a corporate panic, master this verb. It is profoundly resolution-focused. Consider the physical imagery of sorting something out. You sort out a tangled ball of Ethernet cables. You sort out a chaotic, overflowing drawer.
It implies that the current state of affairs isn't fundamentally broken. It's just, well, intertwined and messy.
Yes. It acknowledges chaos without surrendering to it. By promising to sort out the manual request pileup, the chair is pledging to systematically untangle the knot, separate the vital processes from the redundant ones, and impose executive order over operational chaos.
I love the visual of the tangled cables because that is exactly what a rapidly scaling company feels like internally. It's a server room where none of the wires are labeled. But before you can untangle the knot, you have to know who tangled it in the first place.
Exactly.
So the chair asks, what do we think is behind the increase? And Sarah delivers her diagnosis. She says, I think it comes down to two things: higher demand and slower processing.
It comes down to, if you take only one phrase away from this entire deep dive to use in your next board meeting, it should be this one. It is the ultimate C2 level synthesizer verb.
Break the mechanics of that down for us. Why does the IDA comes down to hold so much power in a boardroom?
Because corporate crises are inherently noisy. When a system breaks, there are 50 different symptoms, 50 side effects, and 50 different employees complaining about entirely different things. The cognitive load on a leadership team is overwhelming.
It's just a wall of noise.
Exactly. So to stand up and say it comes down to means you have mentally taken this massive boiling pot of contradictory information, turned the heat up, evaporated all the distracting liquid, and you are now showing the room the absolute hard, irreducible truth left at the bottom of the pan.
It is the ultimate act of reduction. You are stripping away the excuses, the anomalies, the edge cases, and delivering the absolute core of the crisis. It comes down to higher demand and slower processing. Boom, two variables, the noise is gone.
And once Sarah establishes that irreducible truth, Mark immediately jumps in to fortify her position. He says, I'd back that up with the figures. Processing times have gone up by almost 20%. And Sarah follows up by saying there's also been a buildup of unresolved requests.
Okay, let's look at Mark's reaction here. Why does Mark say I'd back that up with the figures? In normal human conversation, if someone makes a point you agree with, you just say, I agree.
Right.
I agree. It's 2 words, it's fast, it's efficient. Why use a 6-word phrase like I'd back that up with? It feels overly structural.
It feels structural because it is structural. And this is a vital distinction for anyone trying to build alliances in a corporate setting. Agreeing is fundamentally an emotional or philosophical alignment. I agree means my personal opinion aligns with your personal opinion.
Sure.
But in a data-driven boardroom, opinions are incredibly fragile. But backing up provides architectural, empirical support.
So it's the difference between cheering from the sidelines and actually getting on the field.
It's the difference between watching a wall lean over and saying, I agree that wall is leaning, versus physically bringing in a steel beam and bracing the wall so it doesn't collapse.
Well, that makes sense.
Mark is reinforcing Sarah's synthesized argument with an unshakable foundation of empirical data, a 20% increase in processing times. He isn't just being a supportive colleague. He's providing the structural integrity that makes her claim bulletproof against the chair's scrutiny.
That makes total sense. He is bringing the receipts to build the wall. And speaking of physical objects, look at what Sarah says right after. She mentions a buildup of unresolved requests. We saw this earlier with shortfall. The verb buildup transforms into the noun a buildup.
The materialization of abstract problems, it's fascinating.
It paints such a suffocating physical picture. When she says a buildup, you can literally visualize a towering, chaotic stack of physical paper complaints sitting on Sarah's desk, growing taller by the minute, threatening to tip over and crush your team. It turns a workflow issue into a physical hazard.
And that shared, terrifying visualization is what unites the room. Which brings us to the climax of the meeting. The problems are now fully exposed. They are bleeding on the boardroom table.
The situation is grim. We have a part shortage from the supplier, we are falling behind the market in the north, and the internal support team is drowning under a massive buildup of manual requests.
It's a lot.
This is the exact moment in a startup's life cycle where one executive team fractures. They start pointing fingers, they panic, they protect their own fiefdoms. But this team enters its final, most critical phase, engineering the pivot.
The chair initiates this final phase flawlessly. They don't dwell on the despair, they don't assign blame, they simply pivot the room's energy by saying, right, let's work out what we can do.
Work out.
The collaborative friction of working out is so important here. Contrast it with a phrase like, let's find an answer. Finding an answer implies that the solution already exists, perfectly formed, hiding under a rock somewhere, and you just have to look hard enough to discover it. It's a passive treasure hunt.
Yeah, like it's just sitting there waiting to be found.
Right. But working out implies a strenuous, active, physical process of forging a solution from raw materials.
It's like going to the gym to work out. It requires sweat, resistance, and tearing muscle fibers to build new strength.
Exactly. The chair is signaling that the solution isn't going to be easy, and it will require collective, exhausting, heavy lifting from everyone in the room.
And the team immediately steps up to the bar. Sarah offers a tactical, immediate suggestion. She says, one option would be to bring in temporary staff.
Notice the spatial urgency of the phrase, bring in. Why doesn't she use the standard corporate term and say, we need to hire temporary staff?
Because hiring sounds like a 90-day HR pipeline.
Right. Hiring implies posting a job description, conducting 3 rounds of interviews, negotiating benefits, and a 2-week onboarding process. Hiring is a long-term, peacetime relationship. But bring in implies immediate spatial insertion. You bring in a SWAT team. You bring in a crisis consultant. You bring in paramedics. It denotes an emergency deployment from the outside world directly into the hot zone to stop the bleeding today.
Is pure triage. But Mark, representing the operational architecture of the company, knows that a human Band-Aid isn't a scalable fix. He agrees with the triage, but he immediately offers a systemic, process-oriented suggestion. He says we could also set up a simpler process for routine requests.
Set up. This phrase is the essence of entrepreneurial architecture. When a system is fundamentally broken, you don't tweak it, you don't adjust it, you set up a new one.
You start fresh.
Exactly. It implies starting from ground zero, laying down a fresh foundation, and erecting a brand new framework. It is an act of creation.
And Sarah responds to Mark's architectural suggestion by stating her ultimate efficiency goal. She says, could we cut down on the manual work?
Cut down on. This is a beautifully precise C1 verb that demonstrates high-level operational maturity. Notice she doesn't say, eliminate the manual work or stop the manual work.
Which would be naive, right? You can never zero out manual labor in a physical supply chain.
Exactly. She knows that friction will always exist to some degree. Cut down on implies a calculated precision reduction.
It makes me think of pruning a bonsai tree. When a tree's overgrown, you don't take a chainsaw and hack the entire thing down to the stump. That kills the tree. Instead, you take small, incredibly sharp shears, and you carefully, methodically remove the inefficient, dying, or overgrown branches. You cut down on the excess foliage so that the core trunk of the business can breathe, receive sunlight, and thrive. They're surgically cutting down the manual labor so the automated processes have room to grow.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. Precision pruning versus blunt force trauma. And I want to pause here at the end of this meeting and ask you to consider the dramatic psychological tone shift that just occurred in this room. Think back to the verbs from the previous section. Falling behind, dealing with, a buildup, a shortfall.
Just saying those words makes your shoulders physically slump. They feel oppressive. They carry the weight of failure.
Now look at the verbs the team deployed in this final 30-second sprint. Work out, bring in, set up, cut down on.
How do those specific solution-oriented verbs physically change the reality of the people sitting at that table?
They force you to regain your executive posture. You physically lean forward. These are verbs of construction, of forward momentum, of intense agency. By deliberately shifting the vocabulary away from passive victimhood and into active engineering, the team has fundamentally altered their psychological state. They stopped being victims of a market bottleneck and became the architects of their own rescue.
It's incredible. When you look at this short exchange, just these last 4 sentences from the source transcript, it serves as a flawless model for agile business thinking. In the span of maybe 60 seconds, this team addressed immediate, bleeding neck triage, bringing in temporary staff to stop the flood, while simultaneously committing to long-term systemic reform, setting up new architectural processes, and surgically cutting down on manual labor.
Triage and reform.
Communicated flawlessly, without a single wasted word or misunderstood intention.
It is, without exaggeration, a masterclass in the mechanics of leadership.
So let's step back and summarize the intense entrepreneurial journey we just navigated. We watched a leadership team walk into a room facing multiple cascading cross-departmental crises. And they didn't just survive the hour, they commanded it. They bent the reality of the crisis to their will.
And they accomplish that entirely by structuring reality through precise language.
Exactly. They started by claiming the absolute ownership of the time, telling the room they were going to get down to business. They established a rigorous flow, deciding what to merely run through and what they needed to heavily take up. They enforced ruthless accountability, ensuring their team wasn't just following up on emails, but actually finding out the truth and coming up with solutions. When the aggregate data was murky and hid the truth, they possessed the courage to break it down. When the interpersonal tension spiked over failures, they de-escalated the ego by demanding their colleagues spell out the mechanics of the problem. When the operational noise was deafening, they distilled it to find exactly what it came down to. And finally, when the room could have fractured into panic, they didn't point fingers. They built a structural rescue plan by working it out, bringing in tactical help, and setting up a new future.
They controlled the verbs, so they controlled the outcome.
Which means, to you listening, you now possess the exact surgical linguistic toolkit required to command your next high-stakes meeting. You don't need a Harvard MBA. You don't need to read a textbook on organizational psychology. And you certainly don't need a vocabulary full of $10 academic words to intimidate people. You simply need to know how to effectively manage both the human ego and the hard data using these incredibly active spatial and visual phrasal verbs.
Which leaves us with a final lingering question to ponder as we close the book on this transcript.
What's that?
We spend so much of our professional lives obsessing over the acquisition of hard skills. We learn Python, we master complex financial modeling, we study macroeconomic market analysis, convinced that these are the keys to the C-suite. But what if the true barrier to your next massive promotion or the success of your startup's next critical pivot isn't your technical competency at all?
Wow.
What if your technical skills are already sufficient, but your vocabulary lacks momentum? Think about it deeply. If you control the verbs, do you actually control the entire perceived reality of the boardroom?
That is a very heavy, very real question to think about before your next calendar invite pops up on your screen. The next time you walk into that room, remember, don't just report the news, command the action. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.